Adventures of Harry Nile.
Chapter 1. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the Seattle rain was coming down in thick, relentless sheets, washing the grime off the streets and straight into the gutters where most of my clients live. I was sitting in my office, watching a water stain on the ceiling expand to resemble a map of South America when the frosted glass door rattled open. The lettering still read Harry Nile, Confidential Investigations in Peeling Gold Leaf. Though confidential usually just meant nobody wanted to admit they knew me. She walked in like she was expecting a trapdoor to open under her feet. She had on an expensive wool coat, cheap scuffed shoes, and a face that had seen a lot of hard miles but knew exactly how to hide the mileage. She did not say a word at first, just stood there, dripping rainwater onto my cracked linoleum, while her trembling fingers dug into her purse for a smoke. I tossed a matchbook. Across the desk, it landed with a dry thud, the loudest noise in the room, besides the rain beating against the window pane. She lit up, her hands shaking just enough to make the flame dance, casting long shadows across her pale face. It was her third cigarette in the last hour, I figured, based on the sharp smell of cheap, stale tobacco already clinging to her damp coat. But the one she had just pulled from her silver case was a high-end Turkish blend. That was the first lie. And she had not even opened her mouth yet. People who smoke imported Turkish blends do not reek of dime store brands, unless they have been spending time in dark rooms they do not belong in, with people they shouldn't know. She exhaled a thick cloud of grey smoke that hung heavy in the stale air of my office, and finally looked at me, with eyes the colour of a bruised sky. She said her name was Evelyn Vance, and she told me her husband had gone missing somewhere between the waterfront docks and a high-stakes poker game down in Pioneer Square. The husband part was probably true. The missing part was likely a convenience, and the poker game sounded like pure window dressing for whatever kind of trouble had really followed her up my stairs. I poured 2 fingers of cheap bourbon into a glass that had only been rinsed twice this week and pushed it across the blotter toward her. She ignored it, which told me she was either too scared to drink or too smart to dull her edge in front of a stranger who made his living in the shadows. I took the shot myself, letting the harsh amber burn remind me I was still alive and kicking in a city that preferred its heroes dead. She reached into her purse again and laid a crisp $50 bill on the desk, the kind of money that usually bought my undivided attention, but the way she nervously smoothed the edges down told me it was the last clean thing she had left in her life. Evelyn claimed he had taken a satchel of bearer bonds and vanished late Friday night, but the mud caked on the heels of her cheap shoes was fresh. Red clay. You only find that kind of dirt out near the new construction sites in Magnolia, not on the slick, rain-washed cobblestones of Pioneer Square. I slid the 50 into my top drawer, leaned back in my creaking chair, and told her to start from the beginning, knowing full well I would have to sift through a dozen more lies before I found a single grain of truth worth bleeding for. Chapter 2. By 5 o'clock, the Seattle rain went straight to heavy artillery, hammering the asphalt until streetlights looked like yellow blurs floating in grease. I tucked my collar tight and headed downhill toward the salt water. The city smelled like wet dog and cheap coal smoke. But if you lived here long enough, you stopped noticing the rot and just got used to the chill. My first stop was a dingy joint near the docks called the Anchor Bar, where the booze tasted like battery acid, and the clientele consisted of off-duty longshoremen and guys looking over their shoulders. Bernie was behind the wooden plank, wiping down a beer tap with a rag that had seen better decades. Bernie was an old war buddy who owed me his teeth after a scuffle in Manila, and ever since, he kept his ears open and his mouth mostly shut unless I asked the right questions. I took a stool at the far end of the counter, out of the glare of the flickering neon sign, and slapped a dime onto the wood. Bernie didn't ask what I wanted. He just poured a finger of rye into a glass marginally cleaner than the rag. He gave me a slow look out of his one good eye, wiped his hands on his apron, and leaned in close enough for me to catch the stink of stale tobacco and peppermint. I asked if he had seen a fellow named Vance, hanging around the Pioneer Square card games over the weekend, playing a big spender with a satchel full of paper. Bernie let out a cough, spat into a copper spittoon, and shook his head. He told me nobody named Vance had been laying down cash in the back rooms, but a slick character fitting that description had been seen getting into a yellow cab right outside on Friday night, arguing heatedly with a dame in a dark coat before driving toward the waterfront. That was the thing about lies. They always left a greasy trail if you knew where to look. Evelyn had told me her husband was playing high-stakes cards down in the square, but the waterfront boys hadn't seen a dime of his money. I finished the rye, dropped another quarter on the counter for Bernie's trouble, and walked out into the downpour to flag down a cab. 5 minutes later, I was sitting in the back of a battered Plymouth, watching the windshield wipers slap a rhythmic beat against the glass while the driver grumbled about the rising price of rubber. I had him drop me off near the precinct house on 3rd Street, where the neon sign glowed like a fresh bruise through the curtain of rain. Inside, the precinct smelled like wet wool, bad coffee, and old floor wax. I walked past the desk sergeant and headed straight down the dim hallway to the Homicide Bureau, where Detective Lieutenant Frank Gallagher sat behind a cluttered metal desk, staring at a stack of manila folders. Gallagher was a heavy, broad-shouldered cop with a square jaw and a sour stomach, but he was one of the few honest men left in a badge who didn't mind trading off the recorded information as long as I didn't make him look bad. He didn't look up when I pulled a wooden chair across the floor and sat down, but he reached into his drawer and tossed a matchbook onto his blotter. It was from the Green Parrot Lounge, a plush joint up near Magnolia, where heavy hitters went to lose money without getting their shoes muddy. Gallagher looked at me over the top of his glasses, his eyes tired and bloodshot from too many late shifts. He told me the department had fished a dead guy out of the mud near a construction site in Magnolia early that morning, shot once behind the ear with a small caliber slug. The dead man didn't have any wallet identification or shoes, but the coroner found a receipt in his coat pocket for a Turkish tobacco shop on First Avenue, stamped with last Thursday's date. Gallagher leaned back in his squeaking chair, folded his hands, and asked why a small-time private eye like me was suddenly asking questions about a dead man who hadn't even hit the evening papers yet. I didn't give him Evelyn's name, and I didn't mention the $50 bill sitting in my desk, but I told him I had a funny feeling that the Seattle rain was about to wash up a lot more than just dirty laundry before the week was through. Chapter 3. I walked out of the precinct into the cold, biting spray, pulling my hat brim down low to keep the water off my neck. The dead man in the Magnolia mud had a bullet behind his ear and a Turkish tobacco habit, which tied him straight back to Evelyn's fancy silver cigarette case and the fresh red clay caked on her shoes. But before I went knocking on her door to ask why she was playing the grieving widow before the body was officially identified, I needed to take a close look at the man who had every reason in the world to want her missing husband put away permanently. That man was Victor Reed, the chief bookkeeper over at the North Coast Shipping Company, where money had been vanishing into thin air for 6 months. The shipping offices were located down on a dark corner of First Avenue, housed in a narrow brick building that smelled of damp wood, engine grease, and cheap floor polish. The night watchman let me in for 50 cents, and a wave of my leather ID flap, pointing me up a creaky flight of stairs toward a corner office, where a strip of yellow light showed beneath the frosted door. I did not bother knocking. I turned the brass knob and stepped right into the room, catching Victor Reed right in the middle of a frantic, burning session. He was hunched over a heavy metal wastebasket, dropping handfuls of torn receipts and ledger pages into a sputtering flame that filled the office with a sharp, acrid smoke. Reed jumped like he had been hit with a cattle prod, knocking a half-empty glass of rye across his desk. He was a skinny, rat-faced man with slicked back hair that was thinning at the crown, wearing a tailored suit that looked 3 sizes too big for his cowering frame. His collar was unbuttoned, his tie was crooked, and sweat was pouring down his forehead in thick beads. Despite the chill in the room, he reached blindly toward a half-open desk drawer, but I took 2 quick steps across the floor and slammed the drawer shut with the heel of my shoe, nearly taking his fingers with it. He scrambled back into his leather chair, hyperventilating and clutching his chest like he was having a heart attack. I picked up the glass off the desk, set it upright, and looked down at the charred fragments of paper blackening at the bottom of the wastebasket. Reed stammered that he was just clearing out old files, but his voice was pitching high enough to shatter glass. He started babbling before I even asked the question, claiming he had not seen his boss since Friday evening, that the books were entirely clean, and that anything missing from the company accounts was taken by somebody else. He went on and on, practically writing his own confession in double time, desperate to convince me that whatever happened down at the docks was none of his doing. He swore up and down that he spent all of Friday night at home with his wife, but he could not keep his hands from shaking enough to light a cigarette. His eyes kept darting toward a framed photograph on the wall that sat crooked on its hook. The guy was behaving like a textbook killer, caught red-handed, with the murder weapon still smoking in his fist. On paper, Victor Reed was the perfect suspect for Lieutenant Gallagher and the boys down at homicide. He had the motive, he had the access to the missing money, and he was currently incinerating evidence in a panicky rush before the cops came knocking. If I had been a lazy man, I would have dragged him down to the precinct right then and called it a day. But hard luck had taught me that real killers do not usually leave a trail of burning paper and nervous breakdown scenes right when a private dick walks through the door. Reed was terrified, but it was the blind panic of a coward who knew he was being set up as the fall guy for something much bigger than embezzled shipping funds. I reached out, pinched the glowing ember out in the wastebasket, and left him shaking in his chair, knowing the obvious answer was almost always the trap somebody wanted me to walk into. Chapter 4. I stepped out into the dark, rain-soaked alley behind the shipping office, pulling my coat tight against the bitter wind blowing off Elliott Bay. Victor Reed was sitting up there in his smoky room, sweating through his expensive suit, and waiting for the hammer to fall, but the whole setup smelled too neat, like a cheap stage play designed for an audience of one. Cops love an obvious suspect because it clears the board before dinner, but whenever a coward starts confessing before he is even accused, it usually means someone else is pulling the strings from the shadows. I lit a cigarette, sheltering the small flame inside my hands, and watched the grey smoke drift up into the steady downpour, while my mind worked back through every piece of garbage I had been handed since Tuesday afternoon. The rain was relentless, turning the pavement into a mirror that reflected the dim, flickering streetlights of First Avenue. I walked 2 blocks north to a late-night diner, a grease trap called the Blue Anchor, where the coffee tasted like boiled asphalt, and the waitress looked like she had seen the city built from the ground up. I took a booth in the back, away from the steamy front windows, and ordered a cup of black mud from a girl named Martha, who didn't bother asking how I took it. I pulled out my small leather notepad, flicking through the scribbled notes with one thumb, while the coffee burned its way down my gullet. Something was bothering me. A small, irritating itch in the back of my brain that had nothing to do with Reed's burning ledgers or Gallagher's dead body in the mud. It was the little things, the trivial details people forget to lie about because they don't think they matter. Evelyn Vance had come into my office talking about high-stakes poker down in Pioneer Square, but the mud on her scuffed shoes was red clay, the exact same red clay found near the new residential foundations out in Magnolia. Then, there was the Turkish cigarette she had smoked in my office, an expensive blend that didn't match her faded coat or her story about a blue-collar husband running out on his debts. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the matchbook Frank Gallagher had tossed across his desk at the precinct house, the one picked up near the Magnolia crime scene. It was from the Green Parrot Lounge, a high-end club where the silk stocking crowd went to drink imported gin and lose their money in carpeted back rooms. I opened the matchbook and stared at the remaining cover. Stamped on the inside flap, almost smudged out by a greasy thumbprint, was a small, blue ink mark from a corner pharmacy over on 10th Avenue. It was the kind of stamp a cashier uses when marking off prescription boxes or high-end cosmetic sales. A man shot behind the ear in a muddy ditch doesn't usually carry a matchbook from a high-class lounge unless he was there meeting someone who belonged in that neighborhood, or unless someone planted it on him to point the finger in the wrong direction. I took another swig of the bitter coffee, letting the harsh heat settle my nerves. Reed was a crook, no doubt about it, but he was a small-time pen pusher who stole figures off a ledger because he was greedy and weak. Shooting a man in cold blood behind a Magnolia construction site took a different kind of nerve, the kind that didn't sweat through a shirt collar at the first sign of trouble. The missing husband, the red mud, the Turkish smoke, and that little blue ink stamp were all pointing away from the waterfront docks and straight toward the fancy houses sitting up on the hill. I dropped a quarter on the formica table, grabbed my hat, and walked back out into the Seattle night. The rain hadn't stopped, but the fog was rolling in off the water now, wrapping itself around the light poles like a damp shroud. I had a phone call to make to a cab company dispatcher, who owed me a favor, and then I was going to pay another visit to Evelyn Vance. She thought she had hired a washed-up private eye who would take her $50 and chase ghost stories around Pioneer Square. But she was about to find out that when you hand Harry Nile a lie, he doesn't stop chewing on it until he gets to the bone. Chapter 5. I ducked into a cramped phone booth on the corner of 4th and Pike, pulling the wooden folding door shut to kill the roar of the downpour outside. The air inside smelled of stale cigar smoke and wet wool, but at least the glass panels kept the bitter wind from blowing my paper match out before I could get a light. I dropped a cold nickel into the slot, dialed the night dispatcher over a yellow cab, and listened to 4 long rings before a raspy voice answered on the line. Red Mahoney was an old-timer who had been dispatching cabs since the city streetcars ran on cable wires, and he knew every stretch of dark asphalt between West Seattle and Lake Union. Red didn't care much for polite conversation, but he remembered 2 things better than any man in King County: crisp dollar bills and taxi trip logs. I asked him to check his log sheets for late Friday night, specifically any runs recorded between the waterfront docks, Pioneer Square, and the high-rent district up in Magnolia. While Red grunted and flipped through his grease-stained ledger pages over the static of the receiver, I pulled out a fresh cigarette and tapped the tip against my thumbnail. Evelyn had sworn up and down to me that her husband, Arthur Vance, had vanished straight out of a backroom poker game near the square around 11 o'clock Friday evening. She had claimed with tears in her eyes that she spent the rest of that night sitting alone in her living room, wringing her hands and waiting for the phone to ring. It was a neat, pathetic story designed to make a gullible private eye feel sorry for a desperate wife. But stories built on thin air tend to collapse when you test them against solid clock hands. Red came back on the line with a raspy cough, his pencil scratching against paper as he read off the dispatch entries. Driver number 42 had picked up a woman matching Evelyn's exact description. Dark wool coat, high upturned collar, head tucked down low against the rainlight, outside the main entrance of the Green Parrot Lounge in Magnolia at 12:45 Saturday morning. She hadn't been waiting at home for a missing husband. She had been dropped off 2 blocks from the muddy construction site, where Gallagher's boys later fished the unidentified body out of a ditch. Even better, driver 36 had picked up a nervous, well-dressed man at that same Magnolia corner 20 minutes later, heading straight back down toward the waterfront shipping offices on 1st Avenue. The timeline Evelyn had fed me was full of gaping holes, big enough to drive a coal truck through sideways. If Arthur Vance was supposedly playing cards down in Pioneer Square at 11, he couldn't have been buying Turkish tobacco at the Green Parrot in Magnolia at midnight, while getting a bullet pressed behind his ear in an unfinished cellar. And if Evelyn was home crying into a handkerchief, she certainly wasn't standing on a rain-slicked curb in Magnolia at 3/4 past midnight, waiting for a Yao cab. Someone had carefully constructed a fake night of gambling and disappearances to cover up a very real meeting that ended with a small caliber slug behind a man's ear and a heavy satchel changing hands in the dark. I didn't stop there. I asked Red about phone calls, routed through the dispatch office, around that same hour. Sure enough, a public payphone right outside the Green Parrot had logged a short call to the North Coast shipping office. At 1:15 inches the morning, right around the time, Victor Reed was allegedly sitting home alone with his wife. That tiny detail smashed Reed's ironclad alibi into 100 sharp pieces of glass. I thanked Red, promised him a bottle of rye on Friday, hung up the receiver, and stepped back out onto the slick sidewalk. The cold rain hit my face like a wet towel, but my head was clearer than it had been all afternoon. The murder wasn't a sudden waterfront robbery or a card game gone sour. It was a cold, calculated execution with a built-in delay designed to confuse the coroner. Evelyn hadn't come into my office to find her missing husband. She had come to hire an unwitting witness who would swear to the police that Arthur Vance was still alive, long after he was already cold in the clay. She thought 60 missing minutes in a dark storm would get lost in the shuffle of a rain-soaked city. But time, in my line of work, is made of tempered steel, and once it breaks, it never bends back into shape. Chapter 6. The rain eased off into a greasy, cold fog as I walked up the steep incline toward the crest of Capitol Hill, where the streets were lined with Victorian houses that looked like old money trying to pretend it was still respectable. Evelyn Vance lived in a narrow, two-story house with faded white paint and dark green shutters that rattled in the damp sea breeze. I didn't bother taking the front steps or ringing the brass bell. Instead, I circled around the side, my feet crunching quietly on the gravel, and worked my way toward the small basement window near the coal chute. The wooden frame was old and rotting from years of moisture, and it took less than 30 seconds with my pocket knife to slip the cheap latch and swing the pane inward. I dropped down onto the damp concrete floor, landing in a crouching position while the cold air from outside rushed in behind me. The air in the cellar was thick and heavy, smelling of mildew, wet coal, and something else, a sharp, metallic tang that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up straight. I flicked my penlight on, keeping the beam small and angled down toward the floor as I navigated past stacks of dusty cardboard boxes and rusting lawn tools. In the far corner of the basement, hidden behind a wooden partition used for storing winter firewood, I found a locked steel trunk covered in a light layer of sawdust. A heavy brass padlock held the latch tight, but a guy who spends his life in the dark corners of Seattle learns early on that most locks are just promises, meant to keep honest people out. I pulled a pair of thin steel picks from my coat pocket and went to work, listening to the tiny tumbler clicks against the quiet hum of the furnace. On the fourth turn, the cylinder gave way with a soft snap, and I lifted the heavy lid. Inside sat 3 leather-bound ledgers, a stack of blank shipping manifests, stamped with the North Coast logo, and a brown paper package tied up with thick twine. I sliced through the twine with my knife and peeled back the paper, revealing stacks of unrecorded bearer bonds tied in neat $1,000 bands, all bearing the official seal of the Seattle Municipal Port Authority. This wasn't just a small-time embezzlement scheme run by a nervous bookkeeper trying to cover his gambling debts. This was a multi-$1,000 fraud operation that had been draining public infrastructure funds right out from under the city treasurer's nose for over 3 years. But the real prize was sitting right underneath the paper wrapper, a second, smaller leather notebook filled with tight, cramped handwriting, detailing a list of blackmail payments made to high-ranking officials in the police department and the waterfront union. Arthur Vance had been the brains and the collector, using his position at the shipping company to siphon off the cash, while keeping an insurance policy on every corrupt man in King County. Sitting right on top of the final ledger page was a small, silver-framed photograph taken 5 years ago, during the war. It showed 3 people standing on a timber pier in Bremerton, smiling for the camera in crisp, dark uniforms. Arthur Vance, a young and remarkably calm Evelyn, and a thin, hollow-cheeked man standing between them, with his arm wrapped tight around Evelyn's waist. The thin man was Victor Reed, looking 5 years younger, 10 pounds heavier, and holding a small silver cigarette case. That was an exact twin to the one Evelyn had pulled out in my office on Tuesday afternoon. Their secret history wasn't a sudden affair or a random coincidence cooked up in a waterfront dive bar. It was an old wartime triangle built on stolen military supplies, false identities, and a shared blood debt that had traveled all the way from the Navy yards to the Seattle docks. Evelyn hadn't just been playing a nervous wife. She was the central pivot holding the entire extortion network together, using 2 different men to build a fortune, while letting each believe he was the only one she truly loved. I closed the trunk, snapped the lock back into place, and wiped my fingerprints off the steel latch with my handkerchief. The fog outside was getting thicker by the minute, but the dark picture inside that cellar was finally coming into sharp, terrifying focus. Chapter 7. I climbed back out through the cellar window and made my way through the thick Cap Hill fog, heading straight down toward the waterfront. The cool mist clung to my trench coat like grease, but my mind was clicking away faster than a streetcar fare meter. Victor Reed's panicked shredding session up on First Avenue, Arthur Vance's sudden bullet behind the ear, and Evelyn's crocodile tears in my office were all pieces of the same puzzle, but it was that throwaway detail from my first 10 minutes with her that kept chewing at my brain. It wasn't the bearer bonds or the blackmail ledger in the cellar trunk. It was the matchbook she had tossed on my desk, or rather, where she had gotten it. She had claimed she hadn't seen her husband since he walked out the door for a card game on Friday evening, leaving her penniless and frantic. Yet, tucked deep into her purse, alongside that fancy Turkish cigarette case, was a small cardboard flap from the Green Parrot Lounge, stamped with that tiny blue ink mark from the 10th Avenue Pharmacy. I pulled my own matchbook out of my pocket, the one Lieutenant Frank Gallagher had found near the body in the magnolia mud, and held it up under the sickly glare of a street lamp on the corner of Pike. They were identical, not just the same club logo, but the exact same blue pharmacy stamp on the inside back cover. right down to the tiny chip, in the numeral 6 on the date mark. That matchbook hadn't dropped out of Arthur Vance's pocket when he hit the cold dirt in Magnolia. It belonged to Evelyn. She was the one who frequented the pharmacy on 10th Avenue for her expensive skin creams, and she was the one who had been at the Green Parrot Lounge late Friday night, waiting in the shadows while her husband met his end. When I had thrown my matches across the desk to her on Tuesday, she had casually pocketed my cover and left behind her own, a classic subconscious trade made by a liar whose hands are moving too fast for her brain to catch up. It was a throwaway clue, something a rookie cop or a green detective would have swept into an envelope and forgotten about while chasing big headlines about missing shipping funds. But, in my line of work, the big lies are always wrapped in tiny, careless habits. Evelyn hadn't just set up her husband for the kill. She had been standing on that rain-slicked curb in Magnolia, watching the whole thing go down, holding the matchbook in her shaking fingers, while Victor Reed pulled the trigger on the man who stood between them and $200,000 in clean bearer bonds. I walked into a brightly lit drugstore on the corner of First and Union, dropped a dime into the payphone, and dialed the precinct house. Gallagher picked up on the third ring, sounding like he had spent the last 6 hours chewing on nails and washing them down with stale coffee. I told him to hold off on swearing out a murder warrant for Victor Reed just yet. I told him Reed was a crook and an embezzler who belonged in a cell at McNeil Island. But if he wanted the person who actually pulled the trigger and planned the execution, he needed to meet me down at the North Coast shipping warehouse, on the docks in 45 minutes. Gallagher grumbled on the other end, growling about private eyes who liked to play God in the fog. But I could hear the sharp scratch of his pencil, taking down the address. He knew as well as I did that a bullet behind the ear in a construction pit didn't fit a weak-kneed bookkeeper who cried when his shirt collar got dirty. The detail that wouldn't die had finally given me the lever I needed to overturn the whole bloody mess. All it took was a 3-cent book of matches and a woman who couldn't keep her habits straight. I hung up the phone, pulled my hat brim down against the mist, and stepped out into the night to set the trap. Chapter 8. The fog on the docks was thick enough to carve with a rusty butter knife, hanging heavy over the still water of Elliott Bay and swallowing the outlines of the cargo cranes. I stood in the shadows beside a stack of damp cedar creosote timbers outside Warehouse 4. My coat collar turned up high against the biting salt chill. It was 20 minutes past 11, and the waterfront was dead quiet, except for the rhythmic slap of oily waves against the wooden pilings beneath the pier. I took out my silver pocket watch, popped the latch, and checked the face under the dim beam of my penlight. Right on time, the low rumble of a heavy engine cut through the silence, and a sleek black sedan crawled through the fog with its headlights turned off. Its tires crunching softly on the wet gravel, the car rolled to a stop 50 yards away near the slipway, its engine idling with a dark, steady purr. The driver's side door opened, and Victor Reed stepped out into the mist, clutching a heavy leather satchel against his ribs, like a man carrying his own heart in a bag. He looked around frantically, his eyes wide and white in the dim glow of a distant dock light, his breath coming out in fast, ragged plumes. 10 seconds later, the passenger door swung open, and Evelyn Vance stepped out. She was wearing her dark wool coat with the upturned collar, her face hidden beneath the wide brim of a black felt hat, looking every bit the cool, calculating widow who had managed to pull off the perfect crime. I let them walk halfway down the dock toward the darkened warehouse before I stepped out from behind the timber stack, the heels of my wingtips striking the wooden planks with a clear, echoing crack. They both froze instantly, Reed letting out a sharp, choked gasp, while Evelyn's hand darted toward the deep pocket of her coat. I pulled my snub-nosed .38 out of my trench coat pocket, keeping it level and steady at Reed's chest. Though my eyes were locked strictly on the woman standing beside him, I told them it was a cold night to be taking a boat ride out of King County, especially with a satchel full of unrecorded municipal bearer bonds and a dead husband cooling off on a slab in the city morgue. Reed's knees nearly gave out right there on the dock, his jaw working up and down, without making a sound, while he stared at the revolver in my hand. But Evelyn didn't flinch. She slowly took her hand out of her pocket, holding up a single finger, as if to check the wind, a bitter, beautiful smile spreading across her lips. She looked at me with those cold, bruised sky eyes, and asked how much it would cost to buy my silence, offering me 10% of whatever was inside that leather satchel, if I just turned around and walked back up the hill to my dusty office. I laughed, a short, dry bark that sounded hollow in the damp ocean air. I told her that $50 had already bought my front row seat for the whole show. I pulled out the small brass whistle Lieutenant Gallagher had given me at the precinct, and blew 3 sharp, piercing blasts into the foggy night. Down at the far end of the slipway, 2 heavy police cruisers suddenly swung around the corner of the brick office building, their red emergency lights spinning through the mist and throwing long, blood-colored shadows across the wooden pier. Sirens began to wail, cutting through the silence of the docks. Like a saw-through bone, Reed dropped the leather satchel onto the damp planks with a heavy thud, sinking to his knees with his hands locked behind his head, sobbing uncontrollably into the ocean breeze. Evelyn didn't drop to her knees. She backed away toward the edge of the pier, her eyes darting toward the dark, churning water were low as the police cars skidded to a halt in a shower of wet gravel. Headlights flooded the dock with harsh white light, trapping the two of them in a bright, inescapable beam. just as Frank Gallagher stepped out of the lead car, with his service revolver, drawn and ready. Chapter 9. Frank Gallagher walked up the wooden pier with his heavy service revolver, held down at his side, the soles of his boots striking the wet timber like a drumbeat. Behind him, 3 beat cops with drawn snub, nosed revolvers fanned out in a semicircle, their shadows stretching long and dark through the fog under the glare of the cruiser headlights. Victor Reed was still on his knees on the cold planks, his hands locked tightly behind his thin neck, blubbering like a kid who had broken a stained glass window and knew the strap was coming. Gallagher didn't even look at Reed. He kicked the leather satchel away from the trembling bookkeeper, sending it sliding across the slick planks toward my feet, and kept his tired eyes fixed squarely on Evelyn Vance. I stepped up beside Gallagher, keeping my .38 steady, while Evelyn backed up until the heels of her cheap shoes hit the wooden guardrail overlooking the black, churning water of Elliott Bay. She didn't look like a nervous client anymore. The frightened act had burned away, leaving behind a cold, sharp blade or a woman who knew the game was up. I laid out the whole chain of deceit right there on the dock, keeping my voice calm and matter of fact while the sea wind whipped her dark coat around her legs. I told Gallagher how Arthur Vance, Victor Reed, and Evelyn had run an embezzlement ring out of the shipping company for 3 years. Using forged manifests and stolen municipal bearer bonds to drain the port accounts dry, it had been a profitable arrangement until Arthur decided he wanted a bigger piece of the pie and started keeping a private blackmail ledger on everyone involved. That was when Evelyn and Reed decided Arthur had outlived his usefulness. They planned the perfect hit for Friday night out in Magnolia, using the ongoing construction site to dump his body where the red clay would swallow his identity. To make sure nobody looked at them, Evelyn had booked a cab to the Green Parrot Lounge, planted a fake story about a high-stakes poker game in Pioneer Square, and then walked into my office on Tuesday with a $50 bill and 3 lies wrapped in a silver cigarette case. She had counted on me following the breadcrumbs down to Pioneer Square and swearing to the police that Arthur was still alive over the weekend, creating a bogus timeline that would shield her and Reed from the murder charge. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had left her own matchbook from the Green Parrot Lounge at the crime scene, stamped with that tiny blue ink mark from her favorite pharmacy on 10th Avenue. When she dropped her twin on my desk Tuesday afternoon, she signed her own death warrant. Reed had provided the gun and the muscle, but Evelyn was the architect who had built the whole maze, leading her husband straight into the dark while holding the hand of her weak-kneed lover. As the full weight of my words settled over the quiet dock, Victor Reed snapped. He looked up from the wooden planks, his face twisted in panic and betrayal, and started screaming at the top of his lungs. He pointed a shaking finger at Evelyn and shrieked that the whole thing had been her idea from the very start, swearing that she was the one who had pulled the trigger behind Arthur's ear while he held the flash lamp. He confessed to the embezzlement, the forged signatures, and the setup, desperate to trade her life for a lighter sentence at McNeil Island. Evelyn looked down at him with pure, unadulterated disgust, her lips curling into a bitter sneer as the cops moved in with heavy steel handcuffs clicking open in the damp air. She didn't cry, and she didn't beg for mercy. She pulled a small, silver-plated derringer from her coat lining, but before she could even raise the short barrel, Gallagher took one quick step forward and slammed his heavy forearm down onto her wrist. The tiny gun went clattering off into the ocean fog, splashing into the dark bay below, and 2 beat cops grabbed her arms, pinning her against the guardrail. She stood tall in the harsh glare of the headlights, her eyes burning into mine with an icy hatred as the cold steel closed around her wrists, trapped by the weight of her own clever words, and 3 cheap cigarettes. Chapter 10. The rain had started up again by the time the patrol wagons hauled Victor Reed and Evelyn Vance away, their red lights fading slowly into the thick, grey soup rolling off Elliott Bay. Frank Gallagher stood beside me on the slick timber dock, lighting a crushed cigar with a wooden match that flared briefly against the dark before dying out in the damp wind. He didn't say much, just gave me a heavy, exhausted nod and patted the leather satchel full of Port Authority bonds, now resting, safely, under his arm. The department had its killer, the city treasurer had its stolen paper back, and the precinct would get a nice round of applause in the morning papers, provided the press didn't dig too deep into the corrupt B-cops mentioned in Vance's little black ledger. I left Gallagher to supervise the waterfront cleanup and started walking back up the steep, dark hill toward 4th Avenue to catch the last trolley car of the night. My feet hurt. My trench coat felt like it weighed 50 pounds, and the cold salt air had worked its way straight into my bones. The street lamps cast long, yellow smears across the wet asphalt, looking like drowning eyes floating in a sea of ink. It was almost 3 inches the morning, the hour when the city finally stopped pretending to be civilized, and just lay there, shivering under a cold blanket of fog. I climbed the creaking stairs to my building, the smell of damp plaster and cheap floor wax greeting me like an old, unwanted friend. I unlocked the frosted glass door, stepped into my office, and didn't bother turning on the electric light. The glow from the street below bounced off the ceiling, casting soft, ghostly shadows across my cluttered desk and the water stain shaped like South America. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out the $50 bill Evelyn Vance had laid down on Tuesday, and smoothed it out on the blotter. It was clean, crisp paper, but it felt dirty in my hand, bought with a lie that had ended with a bullet in a Magnolia mud hole and 2 people bound for the gallows. I opened my middle drawer, tossed the bill inside next to a half-empty bottle of cheap bourbon, and slumped down into my creaking leather chair. The silence in the room was heavy and suffocating, broken only by the steady tap-tap of rainwater leaking into the zinc bucket I had placed in the corner. That was the funny thing about this racket. You spend 3 days running through dark alleys, getting soaked to the skin, and dodging Lee just to untangle a web of human greed and betrayal. And when it is all over, you realize you haven't actually fixed a damn thing. Arthur Vance was still dead in a cold drawer, down at the city morgue. Victor Reed was going to spend the rest of his miserable life behind the stone walls of Meneal Island. And Evelyn Vance would hang from a gallows rope before the winter snows melted off Mount Rainier. The stolen money would go back into the city vault, to be squandered by a new set of crooked politicians. And by next week, another desperate character with a sad story and a pocket full of lies would come stumbling up my stairs, expecting a miracle for $50. I pulled the cork on the bourbon bottle, poured 2 fingers into a dusty glass, and knocked it back in one burning gulp. It tasted like scorched copper and bad decisions, but it took the edge off the chill, settling deep inside my chest. I took out a fresh cigarette, a plain, cheap domestic brand, and lit it with the last match in my cover. I blew a long stream of grey smoke up toward the water-stained ceiling, watching it curl into the shadows before getting swallowed up by the dark. I stood up, walked over to the window, and looked down at the rain-slick streets of Seattle. Just another guy trying to stay dry in a city that never stopped washing its sins down the drain. Chapter 11. The morning came to Seattle, not with a sunrise, but with a slight shifting of the gloom from pitch black to the color of wet slate. I woke up in my office chair with a mouth that tasted like a furnace flue and a dull ache at the base of my skull that coffee wasn't going to cure. The rain against the window pane hadn't stopped. It had settled into a steady, methodical drizzle that felt like it was going to keep falling until the end of time. I pulled myself up, splashed cold water onto my face from the chipped ceramic basin in the corner, and adjusted my shoulder holster. The city was waking up, oblivious to the fact that 2 lives had been ruined down on the docks, while everyone else was asleep. I smoothed out my crumpled trench coat, grabbed my hat off the peg behind the door, and locked up the office. Down on Pike Street, newsboys were already hawking the morning edition of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, their voices cutting through the damp air like rusty blades. I tossed a nickel onto a wooden crate and snatched a paper off the stack, reading the bold black ink screaming across the front page. Dockland murder ring busted in waterfront raid, complete with a blurry photograph of Frank Gallagher looking stoic beside the seawall. There was a tiny paragraph near the bottom, mentioning an unnamed private investigator who assisted the department, standard practice, when the city wanted to keep its image clean. I folded the paper, shoved it into my coat, and walked 3 blocks down to the precinct house to sign my statement. The desk sergeant didn't look up as I passed, just pointed a greasy thumb down the hall toward Gallagher's office. The homicide bureau was humming with its morning misery, phones ringing, typewriter keys clacking like machine gun fire, and suspects sitting on wooden benches looking like they wished they had never been born. Gallagher sat behind his desk surrounded by empty coffee cups and cigarette butts, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. He pushed a stack of typed pages across the blotter, along with a chewed-up pen. I signed my name at the bottom of 3 carbon copies, swearing under oath that my account was complete, omitting only the parts that would make the chief look bad. Gallagher took the papers, checked my signature with a squint, and tossed a brown envelope across the desk. Inside was my witness fee from the prosecutor's office, $12.50 in fresh notes. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to keep my landlord from changing the locks on my door for 2 weeks. Gallagher asked if I was heading back up the hill to sleep. I told him sleep was overrated in a town where the rain never stopped giving people bad ideas. He gave a short, grunted laugh, pulled a fresh case file from his inbox, and went back to work. The wheels of justice were already grinding forward, ready to chew up the next desperate soul who thought they could outsmart the law. I stepped out of the precinct onto the top step of the granite entrance, looking out over 3rd Avenue. The fog had lifted to reveal the dark grey waters of the bay stretching out toward the Pacific, cold and indifferent. I pulled a cigarette from my pack, struck a match on the stone balustrade, and cupped my hands against the wind until the tip glowed orange. I took a deep drag, letting the hot smoke fill my lungs before exhaling it into the wet air, where it vanished. Evelyn Vance was sitting in a holding cell down the hall, waiting for a lawyer who couldn't save her from the gallows. Victor Reed was on a bus bound for the penitentiary, staring out the wire mesh window. The bearer bonds were locked in a vault. The shipping company would hire a new bookkeeper by noon, and the rain would keep washing grime down the gutters. I turned up my coat collar, shoved my hands into my pockets, and stepped off the curb into the downpour. Another case was in the books. Nothing was better, and Harry Nile was right back where he started.